Okay, well, thanks, Dave, and welcome everybody to this session today. I'm Shem Gold, and I'm on the VicTESOL committee, and I'd like to welcome all the participants and thank you for joining us. The session Motivating Learners in the Language Classroom with Mairin, Hennebry-Leung and Andy Gao. I'll introduce them in a second, but before I do that, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country and begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we meet you on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend this acknowledgement to the lands on which you're joining us from today. I'd also like to acknowledge the lessons that we learn as educators and teachers from Aboriginal people who've created and maintained links through language that have lasted for many thousands of years. So today's presentation, the format of the event is going to be, there'll be a presentation of about 30 minutes, followed by some discussions in breakout rooms of around 20 minutes, and then coming back to the main rooms with feedback to the main group of around 10 minutes, and then there'll be a Q&A session for about the remaining 20 minutes. And then there'll be a roundup and some recommendations for the last 10 minutes or so. So during the session, you can use the chat function down in the menu, and the Zoom menu below, which I think most people are fairly familiar with by now, to ask any questions there as things go on. For the breakout rooms, please, when we ask you to go to the breakout room for the group discussion, you'll see a link that you'll be able to click on, and that will take you to the breakout room, and that'll happen during the discussion section. If there's any technical difficulties during the session, please use the chat function to talk to Carly or email her at VicTESOL at victesol.vic.edu.au, the address on the screen there. So I'd just like to introduce the presenters. Our presenters today are Dr. Mairin Hennebry-Leung. Mairin's a lecturer in languages and TESOL at the University of Tasmania, and before that she's had posts in Hong Kong, Scotland and England, working in language education and language teacher education. She has delivered professional development events and materials for teachers in a number of countries, and her research focuses on language classroom language learning, and specifically on language learning motivation. Our second presenter is Associate Professor Andy Gao, who works at the School of Education at the University of New South Wales, and he's been involved in language teacher education in Hong Kong, mainland China and Taiwan, and his research interests include language learning autonomy, language education policy and language teacher education. And both our presenters today have widely published in a number of journals, and both are co-editors on the journal system and other publications. So I'd like to welcome our presenters and hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Shem, for that introduction, and thanks to VicTESOL for having us here. It's a real pleasure to be with you all and to be able to share a little bit of our work today. And so we're going to be talking about motivating learners in the language classroom. And the first thing I think that Andy and I were both keen to say is that we are not the experts in classroom teaching, you are the experts. So what we're here to do today is to share some of our research, and perhaps that's a strength that we bring, is that we have the resources and opportunities to sort of do systematic and a large scale research and to identify those trends and patterns that we see in classrooms. But we're very keen to hear from you and very keen to hear your insights and your responses to what we're sharing, and how you sort of make meaning of what we're sharing for your own practices as well. So we hope there's going to be some lively discussion later on. Now, you had a poll to share that I think David distributed. So I wonder if we could see the results of that. David, is it possible to share that? There we go. So the question was, do you think about the medium of instruction you use as a tool for shaping learners' motivation? And we can see the majority say yes, which means that our work is done and we can go home. That's pretty much what our presentation is focusing on today. But we're going to be looking a little bit more at the intricacies of what that might look like in the classroom. So the focus today, I'm going to be talking a bit about the study, a big study that we did in Hong Kong. And then this is looking at language learning motivation. And then Andy's going to take over and talk a little bit about how we interpret what we find and we apply it to our classroom practices. And we're going to explore that in our discussions a little bit as well. So the focus of the study was we wanted to understand whether the classroom context makes a difference to motivation. That may sound an obvious question to you as teachers, but in the research literature, we don't know much about the role of the classroom context. We know a little bit more about the role of learner traits in motivation, and we know a little bit more about the role of teacher practices, but not about features of the learning environment. This is something that needs further exploration. And this question was also underpinned by the assumption that language learning and language learners don't exist in cognitive isolation. So whatever's happening in the brain is very much in a mutually constitutive relationship with what is surrounding them, with their contexts, whether that's the micro, meso, or macro context. So those two things are constantly interacting with one another and shaping one another. And so there is a need to better understand the role of the classroom context in shaping motivation. So when we think about the role of context, first of all, we want to understand the way that the learner's interactional context, the immediate interactional context that they work in, the way those shaped their motivation, essentially. So what happens in those immediate interactional contexts is obviously shaped by institutional features. And when we say institution, in this case, we mean the school. And the school features are shaped by the macro level context. So in other words, if we work our way down, we can say language policy has an impact on the way that schools practice and on the way that language teaching evolves. And that in turn has an impact on the kind of interactions that learners have access to and that learners participate in. So these embedded contexts really influence one another and influence learners' motivation. Medium of instruction, we can say, plays a role in creating different kinds of context. So depending on the medium of instruction that learners are exposed to, will vary the kinds of linguistic groups that they access, the kinds of linguistic opportunities that they have in order to develop linguistic practices and develop multilingual repertoires. And as a very obvious example, if you have a learner who is learning in a dual mode of instruction, they will have more multilingual opportunities than a learner who's in a monolingual medium of instruction setting. So that's kind of where we're going with this. So we've got these micro, meso, and macro contexts. We've got the micro, which is the immediate interactional context. We've got the meso, which is the institutional, so the school context. And we've got the macro context, which is the sort of sociocultural context, the kind of policy context and so on. And that can also be the social context in terms of wider attitudes to language learning and the kinds of structural features of a society and the way that they relate to language learning as well. And these can either enable or they can constrain the kinds of identities that students imagine for themselves and the extent to which they can actually bring those about. They can actually actualize those identities. The opportunities to develop and to enact those multilingual identities are really important. They're really crucial for preparing learners for multilingual society. Nowadays, there's pretty much, it would be difficult to find a society that is not multilingual today. Even in countries that think of themselves as monolingual, that's probably not the case. So this multilingual competency is really necessary for students everywhere, but it's particularly necessary in contexts where we see a particular language being used, playing a gatekeeping role. So we'll know that we know that very often English actually plays that role. The English language plays a gatekeeping role by allowing access to other opportunities or inhibiting access to other opportunities. And this is very much the case in the context of Hong Kong, which is where our study took place. So some of you may be familiar with the context of Hong Kong, but essentially, you know, in Hong Kong, the role of English really kind of comes to the fore in terms of the sort of job opportunities, the access to higher education and so on that students may have access to. So narrowing down a little bit on this context, and this was the context of our study, Hong Kong has seen quite a lot of shifts actually in language policy. But after the 1997 handover, the Hong Kong policy shifted from a heavy emphasis on English to a heavy emphasis on Chinese. Later on, they introduced a fine-tuning policy, which responded to particular political pressures, but also to the kind of pragmatic needs that students had for English. And the fine-tuning policy meant that schools had some flexibility to adapt their medium of instruction policy according to the needs they had and the needs of their students and according to the resources that they had. So what you have nowadays in Hong Kong is you have, in Hong Kong secondary schools, you have essentially 3 kinds of schools, although officially it's kind of more 2, but unofficially it's really 3. So you have English medium instruction schools, Chinese medium instruction schools, and mixed mode instruction schools. Chinese medium schools are characterized by practically exclusive use of Chinese, and that is true inside and outside the classroom. And when we're talking about the English classroom, you'll often find that going in there, there's quite a lot of Chinese that is used in teaching English as well. Mixed medium instruction schools officially have to have up to 25% of the curriculum that is delivered in English, and typically that tends to be science and maths lessons that are delivered through English. But beyond the classroom, there's very little English, if any, used at all. And even within those subjects where officially they would be delivered in English, you'll find there's often a lot of Chinese used as well. In English medium instruction schools, I don't have it here, or I do have a little bit of it here, but in English medium instruction schools, obviously officially, the medium of instruction is English for all subjects. But again, you will obviously see some code switching, not to the same degree as you would see in CMI and MMI schools. But the language used outside the lessons in EMI schools is often Cantonese anyway, and there's a lot of translanguaging that goes on, and that's particularly evident in EMI schools. The medium of instructions, these 3 different medium of instruction settings that are available in Hong Kong really reflect the macro level policy. So you can see Hong Kong is a really nice example where you can see the embedded nature of those contexts and the way they influence one another. But it's important to note also that medium of instruction is a decision that is made for the learners, but not by the learners. And so later when we come to notions of agency, already those kinds of ideas should be coming up in our minds, the extent to which learners are able to make decisions about the medium of instruction that they learn in, and so on. Obviously, the medium of instruction policy, the way that it then plays out into schools does mean that there are different kinds of linguistic interactions that are available to learners depending on which stream they've ended up in. And as I said, they don't always have a choice of which stream they end up in. So an EMI setting, we can argue, would offer a much richer multilingual context because at the very least there is compulsory learning through the medium of English, whereas CMI and MMI are almost exclusively Chinese settings. Okay, so now just to, without wanting to sort of go into too much theory, but for the study that we were conducting, we used a range of theories looking at learner motivation. And the way that we chose the theories was essentially thinking about the context of Hong Kong and thinking what was most relevant to the kinds of issues that we were familiar with in the Hong Kong setting. So we drew on, and some of you may be familiar with some of these ideas, Gardner's model, which was the socio-educational model that talks about integrative motivation and instrumental motivation, and we'll look at those 2 concepts in a moment. Dernier's model of the L2 motivational self, where he talks about the ideal L2 self and the ought to L2 self. The required orientation, which is a sort of slightly lesser known motivational construct, which essentially is specifically targeting at Asian societies, and the argument by Chen and his colleagues is that the importance of exams and doing well in exams is so strong in a society like Hong Kong and a society like China, like Taiwan, that it merits in itself its own construct, particularly because of the sort of educational roots that come with exam performance. And the other concepts that we should be familiar with are the notion of agency, which Andy's going to talk about later on. We wanted to talk about agentive orientations and non-agentive. So when we look at integrative orientation, the ideal L2 self, the instrumental orientation, we were starting to think, could we argue that some of these are more agentive than others? And so the way that we conceptualized that was to think about agentive orientations as those that are kind of more learner owned. So they're sort of more rooted in the learner's own cognitive and affective resources, whereas the non-agentive might be more rooted in features of the sociocultural context or significant others, rather than in the learner themselves. So there's less agency involved if your orientations are grounded in something outside of yourself than if they're grounded in something inside yourself. And as I said, Andy will talk a bit about these notions later on. So these were the questions that we were asking. To what extent do agentive and non-agentive motivational orientations predict language attainment? So do they actually have an impact on language attainment? Can they predict language attainment across the medium of instruction settings? To what extent do the relationships between different kinds of motivation and language attainment vary across different medium of instruction? So do we see that children in an English medium of instruction setting have different kinds of motivation coming through than children, for example, in a Chinese medium of instruction setting? And then to what extent can non-agentive motivational orientations, to what extent do they better explain language attainment than agentive orientation? So which one kind of comes out more strongly there? Our participants were Hong Kong secondary school learners. So we took obviously children from EMI, CMI and MMI schools. The language used, I've said this already, but the language used outside lessons in EMI schools tends to be Cantonese, so just bearing that in mind. CMI school, almost exclusive use of Chinese, and MMI up to 25% in English, possibly, not always. We used questionnaires, and I should mention that our sample was something around 3,800 children, something like that. So we used questionnaires, a bilingual version on a 4-point Likert scale, so strongly agree to strongly disagree. We had several items for each motivational construct, so that could help us to have a little bit more reliability and a little bit more consistency across our constructs as well. And we also used a closed test. So a closed test is essentially a gap fill that we designed specifically for this. So we wanted to see that relationship between motivation and language attainment. And so that was the test that we used for language attainment. So these were the specific motivational constructs we looked at. Integrative orientation, and you may be familiar with some of these already, but this orientation essentially says that learners have a disposition towards the target language group, that they want to learn to communicate with the group and to understand and participate in their culture. This was one of Gardner's proposed orientations. Then we had instrumental, and instrumental we can think of in two dimensions. One is promotion and one is prevention. So instrumental promotion is thinking about wanting to get the pragmatic gains that you can have from learning a language, whether that's better career opportunities, whether that's just perceived social status. And instrumental orientation prevention is where you want to avoid particular negative outcomes of not learning language or not doing well in a language. So, being perceived less desirably in society. And then we have the ideal and ought to L2 selves, and these were Dernier's constructs. So the ideal self is this kind of vision of who the learner would like to become. This has been a big idea that Dernier has pushed for a number of years and has really become very popular in research. And he's sort of shifted from talking about the selves to talking about the role of vision in the classroom and vision in the language classroom. And all of this is rooted very much in studies in psychology. But this idea basically says that as the learner sees where they are now, their actual self, and what their ideal self would be, their ideal L2 self, that gap, the desire to meet that discrepancy, to bridge that discrepancy, is what motivates them to learn the language. And then there's the ought to L2 self, which refers to the role of significant others, whether that's the teachers or parents, in terms of expectations in language learning and language success. And finally, the required orientation. And that's what I mentioned before, particularly related to exams and a need to fulfill exams and to perform well in exams. So those were the sort of motivation orientations that we were looking at within our survey. I don't know if you want to know this, but for those who are interested, we did regression analysis, which is where we're basically modeling the data in different ways to look at what is the best predictor of language attainment. So we tried different kinds of combinations of orientations, of motivation orientations, and we look at which one's the strongest predictor. And when you're looking at the numbers, it might be helpful to have this in mind. It'll appear on each of the slides as we go forward. But these might be quite useful just to help you think about the meaning of the results. So I think there is a poll now, just before we go into the results, to see if you can predict what you think the results might be. So if we just go through the questions, essentially the questions are the same, but the first one is for English medium instruction, then Chinese medium instruction, and then mixed medium instruction. So what we're asking you to do is, can you predict which motivational orientation you think came out most strongly in the EMI, in the CMI, and in the MMI? So maybe we'll just give you a few moments to do that, otherwise I'll do a big reveal. David, are we getting some results in? Okay, here we go. So let's see. So we have in the EMI, we think the instrumental promotion was the strongest. Interesting. In the CMI, we think the required orientation was the strongest. And in the MMI, we're not very sure. So it looks like the strongest is integrativeness, but not far off is the required orientation. So, okay, thanks very much. So now let's have a look at what our results told us. Okay, so in the EMI context, and this is where I think you said the instrumental promotion would be the strongest. So what we saw was a significant positive relationship between integrative orientation and language proficiency. That's fine. But then we ran a model again, and what we saw was that there was a significant positive relationship between ideal L2 self and proficiency. We didn't see any particular relationship between the required orientation or between instrumental promotion. So what we're saying for the EMI context is that we saw essentially the strongest relationship was between an ideal L2 self and proficiency, and not far off from that was also the integrative orientation. So those two were the strongest competitors in the EMI context, but instrumentalism promotion didn't really come through. Instrumental prevention was a negative predictor, which you might expect, and the required didn't really feature in the EMI context. Then in the mixed mode of instruction, and I think here we were split in our responses between integrativeness and the required, I think if I remember right. So what we found here was essentially, oh thanks, thank you. In the MMI, sorry, we said required orientation and integrativeness. Yes, so that's good. Okay, so hold on. Okay, so let me just close that poll. Okay, so in the MMI context, we found a significant positive relationship between integrative orientation and proficiency and instrumental promotion and proficiency. But then when we added the ideal self, we saw that there was a stronger relationship there between the ideal L2 self and proficiency. And then when we added the required orientation, we found that there was a particularly strong relationship between the required orientation. So this is where I remind you of those numbers when we're interpreting effect sizes. And if you look at the top right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see how we can interpret those sizes. So 0.25 is a large effect size. That means it's a really strong predictor. And if we look at the effect size for required orientation, we'll see it's 0.29. So that was really by large the strongest predictor in the mixed mode instruction context. Okay, and then we have our CMI context, and here we found a significant positive relationship between instrumental promotion and proficiency, and a negative one between instrumental prevention. Then we added the ideal and the L2 self, but they didn't make any difference in terms of the predictive model. And finally, we added in the required orientation. And here we saw that it had above and beyond explanatory power. In other words, it was the strongest predictor. And we can see that at 1.16, it's between moderate to large effect size. So in the EMI context, just to sum up, ideal L2 self consistently served as the salient factor, positively predicting attainment. In the CMI, we had ideal and L2 selves. They failed to significantly predict close scores, either positively or negatively. And in the CMI and the MMI, but not in the EMI, we had required orientation coming out really strongly. So L2 selves in ideal L2 self in the EMI, but the required orientation in the CMI and the MMI. So to summarize, and going back to our questions, we asked, to what extent do agentive and non-agentive motivational orientations predict language attainment across medium of instruction settings? And we can say that both agentive and non-agentive motivational orientations do predict participants' language attainment. So there is that relationship between the orientations and language attainment. To what extent do the relationships differ as a function of differences in medium of instruction? In the EMI settings, agentive orientations emerged as the more significant predictors. In the MMI and CMI, non-agentive, or let's say better, less agentive orientations were more salient. And finally, to what extent can non-agentive motivational orientation exert over and beyond explanatory power over agentive motivational orientation? So what we can say is that in both the CMI and in the MMI settings, non-agentive orientations did exert above and beyond explanatory power over agentive motivational orientations in terms of language attainment. So I think I'm handing over to Andy at this point, so I will stop sharing and then Andy can take over and talk us through some of the interpretations.
Right, thank you, Mairin. Thank you, VicTESOL, for inviting us to give this talk on motivation. Now, I would like to draw on the research results from the project we conduct on language learning and motivation in mixed, a variety of medium instruction contexts in Hong Kong. I think we can come up with these 4 messages for language teachers. First of all, this research says learners with a sense of their own agency are more likely to be engaged, invest in their language learning, so they'll be more motivated. And the second is, say, because the context plays such an important role in motivating students, we believe that teachers also play a very important role in facilitating the development of learner agency by providing the kind of opportunities for students to exercise enhanced agency for motivated language learning. And third message is agency does not reside solely in the learner, as we can see that motivation does not solely rely or reside in language learner themselves, but it is negotiated and supported by all stakeholders in ecology. The context becomes very important. The medium instruction matters in this case, as most of us respond to the survey. The fourth message is really to do with the meaning of our pedagogical efforts and professional practice, that we believe that students who develop agency are prepared not only for success as language learners, but also for the challenges and opportunities in life beyond the classroom, in the present and future, considering the, say, the climate we are living now. The world becomes increasingly uncertain, and there's a lot of risk or change that students have to be prepared for. So we prepare our language learners. We just not only teach languages, but we also prepare them for the kind of challenge beyond the classroom. There are a few practices that we think that can help to promote high learner agency, which will lead to enhance the motivation in language learning. First, I can think of the pedagogical suggestion where we can invite students set learning goals. Remember, agency is the kind of meaningful action that students or language learner can take to effect changes in their learning process or life. So we can somehow in the learning process invite students to set learning goals. Or we can think of, instead of just asking students to read or process the text or materials we gave them or prepare for them, we can ask or give opportunity for to students to generate their learning content. Because I mean, with this technology development or the access to the internet, the students can access a lot of information and they can work on, say, a project on environmental protection, and then they can generate relevant learning content after they do search in the internet or searching in their real life situations. They can come up with something that will be meaningful for sharing in class. And we should also think about how we can promote learning-centered teaching. We can start with what the students know and what the students are interested in learning more, and we can build on teaching on this what their interests and needs and their prior learning achievements. Or we can prepare teaching response to, say, emerging learning situations. While planning will not be fixed, or we need to be really flexible, because we might spot a valuable learning opportunity when we're interacting with students. As students make meaningful contribution by responding to our teaching, and we need to seize that kind of the moment so that the learners can learn more from our responsive teaching. And we sometimes can use a language other than English, because we want to help students recognize they have resources in them. The resources could mean the kind of language they have already learned or they have already mastered, and that these languages other than English could help be a meaningful resource for them to learn the language. So they feel that they can do something, they have the power, they have the capacity, they have resources. They feel much more empowered, enabled to make changes to their learning process. Or we can have, say, open-ended activities which allow students of different levels of achievement to come up with the kind of outcomes they can achieve, instead of have a fixed objectives. We also can support students forming to form supportive learning communities. For instance, writing is usually considered as individual activities, but we can encourage language learners to learn and write together collaboratively, so they can probably draw each other's resources instead of having individual learner agencies. You can have a collective agency, which may be more powerful than individual learner agency. And the whole process may become more motivating for them as well. And when we encourage learners to form supportive learning communities, we can also work together with learners to explore answers together. So instead of placing ourselves as above language learners, which sometimes in some cultures, language learners tend to see teachers as the source of authoritative authority. But if we somehow can lower down our position and we can work together with learners, and that will somehow give language learners belief in their capacity and power to do something meaningful to their learning process. And we can think about learner-driven feedback, which gives learners some, say, opportunity to express what kind of feedback they would like to have, which aspects of languages they would do to give feedback on. Or we can adopt reciprocal teaching, so it allows a student to teach, which will, we actually learn more by teaching ourselves. So students may learn more by teaching the content that will be normally taught by you. Of course, we'll be providing support, a scaffolding support, enable them to can teach well, and learn in the process. I think the most important thing in all the teaching practice or the related teaching practice with high learner agency, or promote the kind of learner agency for a motivated language learning process is to encourage students to really reflect on their learning progress, and they become aware what they have been doing, how well they've been doing, whether they have been achieving their goals, what they need to do to achieve their learning goals. And when we encourage students to reflect on learning progress, we should also motivate ourselves to reflect on teaching practice, whether we have been doing well, and whether we can sort of adjust a little bit to make our teaching teaching practice to be with high learner agency. So we can adjust our teaching, adopt or teaching strategies that can promote a learner agency for motivated language learning. We know that it's somehow easily said, then, because a learner agency is a complex thing. It's very much situated in a complex ecology. Just like the motivation we share, and the context has significant or profound impact or mediation on language learner motivation, saying the context or contextual conditions will have very profound impact or mediation on learner agency. And here's a few things that might significantly influence or mediate learner agency. For instance, we have stakeholders, we have different kind of values or attitudes being circulated around in a given context, or we have teaching materials. Of course, we have teachers as an important stakeholder, and we have time and place. We have this variety of stakeholders which might influence our teaching. This is just a few of them. We have policy makers. We have people who set up the standards of teaching. We have school leaders who formulate, implement policies which may allow particular teachings to happen, or which discourage teachers from adopting another kind of teaching practice. And we have teacher educators who will provide a kind of knowledge or theories to teachers. We have parents who will be somehow profoundly influencing our way of teaching, because they constantly, well, I mean, nowadays parents will interact with teachers and constantly give up feedback to our teaching. And of course, the most important stakeholders in the whole teaching process is our students, because in any learning and teaching situations, students or teachers teach, and what students will need to somehow learn and demonstrate the impact of teaching on their learning progress. And there are a variety of beliefs and attitudes which might facilitate or constrain our efforts to promote learner agency in the motivated language learning process. For instance, whether we have this growth mindset, whether we believe all learners have the ability to learn or succeed, or we think some learners are actually problems that need to be somehow fixed through pedagogical process, whether we have this value for mutually respectful relationship, because in some contexts you may try to kind of context I'm familiar with, that the teachers trying to promote competition as a motivating strategies to motivate students to learn. I've seen teachers trying to say, well, group students into different groups, and they compete with each other in order to make sure that they put maximum efforts in the learning process. We believe that we need a mutually respectful relationship, which is very important for community building and collective agency development. And also we need to think about whether we value outside school learning, because students have, nowadays the students, I think in comparison when we were students in schools, they're much better informed. So there are a lot going on in outside school. situations. There are a lot of learning going on in outside school situations. So we need to really synergize the kind of formal learning in school and informal learning outside school. And we might need to develop a set of common principles which will manage students' expectations, or which will be very useful for behavioral management as well. These common set of principles would be very useful for us to build a positive collective agency for learners and teachers. We know what we need to do, what we expect to do in the pedagogical or learning process. And of course, the importance of teaching materials and whether these teaching materials are developed by students or teachers, or by even big publisher, or the kind of materials you use. We know that teachers play a very important mediating role between materials and learners, and the kind of materials, the value that endorsed by the particular teaching materials will be somehow passed on to the learners through teachers' mediation in teaching. We also know that now learners are no longer passive consumers of teaching materials. They can be active users of teaching materials, and they can even be creators of teaching materials, especially considering the technological development. We can really transform our learners into creators of digital materials for learning and teaching. Teaching materials can support innovation. For instance, nowadays we instead of the kind of traditional paper-based kind of materials, we have a lot of multimodal learning resources that could be used to promote motivated language learning. We have activities that's supported by teaching materials. For instance, you can have materials activities that promote facilitated learning by inquiry instead of just a kind of a passive learning. If we have activities that promote that kind of learning by inquiry, give students a lot of choice, and also enable students to feel that they are able to do something in the learning process. But there are challenges. For instance, we need to deal with different kind of cultural, social expectations. We know that some students will have different kind of cultures for learning, and where teachers always respect as the source of their authority. We also need to think about teacher development, because agency is not something we used to talk about a lot in teacher education programs. And we also need to consider individual differences of language learners. For instance, different learners of different age may have, we need to have different kind of strategies in order to promote or foster their learner agency. Learners may have different kind of prior experiences, or they have different knowledge of English, and they may have different attitudes towards particular things we do. And also it's quite challenging when we have students of different cultural backgrounds or linguistic backgrounds in the same classroom. And there are also contextual conditions, resources we need to consider in some contexts. You have large classrooms, and in this climate, we have to do a lot of teaching online, which is quite different from physical classroom and the kind of traditional classroom we used to implement our teaching. And also in some contexts, you have high stake tests as well. We can think about some possible solutions. We can think about if we have to deal with different kind of cultural, social expectations, say in relation to teachers' roles in the pedagogical process. We may need to create activity to engage students with popular beliefs explicitly through discussion, so that students can be encouraged to search for alternative beliefs or discourses about teachers' roles in the pedagogical process. And when you think about issues like teacher development, VicTESOL, the kind of seminar or talk like this one's very important, but we also need to promote teachers' capacity to foster or promote learner agency through teacher-led inquiry groups or action research, even exploratory practice. And if we have to deal with individual different language learners, we may need to think about ways to develop tailor-made or appropriate practice for different students. For instance, like open-ended activity will be quite good if we have students of different linguistic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, or even language learning achievements. And we need to think about the, if we have to deal with, say, contextual conditions resources, for instance, like big class, we need to think about how to divide big class into smaller groups for forming the supportive learning communities, or how we can use technology to promote interaction if we need to teach languages online. We think learning agency should be a very important pedagogical focus if we think about how we can motivate students to learn languages, because as English language educators, we are committed to, say, helping language learners to make a difference in their lives and the learning process. So this is very important. If they believe they can make differences in their lives in the learning process, they will become more motivated. And as English language educators, we are committed maximizing their potential, and then they become lifelong learners. Not just we talk about learning within the classroom, but we also talk about language learning beyond the classroom, in the rest of their lives. And because they are constantly expected to learn new things, because the world is changing all the time. And we know that as language learners and teachers, we all have to respond to challenges, opportunities beyond classrooms. There's challenges in teaching, but there's also challenges beyond the classroom as well. But they also come with opportunities that we can help students or help us to improve their skills, capacities, in preparation for the challenges beyond the classroom. And we need to somehow negotiate a complex contextual process, because we teach in a very increasingly complex situations, considering the impact COVID or the sudden switch to online teaching. We need to negotiate with these complex contextual conditions, and through negotiation, we need to create enabling conditions to help students to develop their learning agency. It's very important for us to remember the agency. Yes, I mean, it's very much to do with kind of contextual mediation, but it's also within the language learners, we somehow need to invite language learners to use agency and create these kind of opportunities for them to exercise agency, so they can become increasingly emboldened, enabled to use more and more the agency, and they can develop further. It's very important for us to remember our role as enablers, language teachers as enablers, and sometimes we are very busy with teaching say language structures and vocabulary and all these things, that the kind of so-called the language. But we also need to recognize that we, as teachers, we not only teach language, but also we teach learners. We want our learners to become the kind of persons, and they'll be who are ready for the challenge beyond the classroom, basically, in the real life world. So we need to remember that we are teaching learners as well as we are teaching language. Okay, I think it's
discussion time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks very much, Andy. So what we thought, I think there's quite a lot there. Some of it will be familiar to you already. Some of it may be new ideas for you. But we thought it might be good to have a little bit of group discussion. And there are some questions in the chat if you've not been able to access them through the website that has been shared by, I think, Carly or David earlier on. So they're there in the chat. There's basically just 3 questions. One is just, take some time just to kind of raise any questions that came out from the presentation for you. Feel free to spend some time discussing those. And then moving on to what might it look like to promote learner agency in the TESOL classroom, and specifically, I guess, in your classroom. So it'd be great for you to kind of think about your specific learners in your contexts and to share a little bit about that. And then to what extent do you think it matters what kind of motivational orientations learners have? So that goes back to the findings that we were talking about before. So if we could ask that somebody in the group volunteered to just take some notes or just kind of store it up there in your mind so you can share your group discussion with the wider group when you come back from the breakout rooms, that would be great. So I think Carly's going to put you into random breakout group rooms. So we've got about 20 minutes for discussion, and you'll be told about 5 minutes from the end to get ready to kind of come back to the main room. Yep, okay. Okay, so I suspect that probably you could have done with more time. That's normally the case with these kinds of discussions, but we have to keep to schedule. So I wonder if people would be happy to share some of the key points that emerged from your group discussions. You can either do that by putting some notes in the chat, or if you would like to just turn on your microphone and share orally, that would be great as well. We love to hear other voices than our own. So, you know, if you're happy to do that, that would be fantastic. But if otherwise, if you're happy to put them in the chat, that would be good, just so everyone can see where your discussion sort of went. So we'll wait to see.
I'm happy to talk.
Brilliant. Yay.
Yeah, and Yupon, I'm the one who dropped out for a bit. Sorry.
That's right.
Well, I'm back in before I drop out again. I'll talk.
Good. All right. Thanks, Annette.
Yes. So my group members were Melina Piakis, Victoria, and Alize. So we just talked about our quite diverse, sorry, no, not Melina, her microphone wasn't working, so I'm glad I'm not the only one with technical issues today. But we just talked about our different, very different teaching environments and teaching challenges and how that impacts on learner motivation. Basically, there's no magic wand, there's no silver bullet.
No.
You just have to remain as responsive and as flexible as you can. You know, and always be willing to try new things, but at the same time recognizing the constraints of the volume of curriculum you've got to cover, and bearing in mind things like, you know, assessment, washback, and so on. But it would be hard to summarize our discussion because we're dealing with very, very different groups in different countries in some cases. So yeah, I don't know if that speaks to what you were expecting, but that's where our discussion went.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks. And I think it probably does speak very much to what we were expecting. And it's always reassuring to have teachers say there's no magic bullet, because I think, you know, the worst thing for us is when somebody says, tell me how to motivate my learners. And there isn't a magic bullet.
I think there are as many bullets as there are students. That sounds exactly violent. But I mean, I mean, everyone is an individual, and their circumstances and motivations are unique. So you really have to continually adapt your delivery. You try to make it as learner-centered as possible, but for some people, if you're teaching groups of 40 plus, you know, that is really a big ask. You do what you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks very much for that.
Now and turn myself off.
Okay, thanks, Annette.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you.
I think we had the other Annette with a hand up. Annette Brennan, did you want to share something?
Yeah, sure. We were talking to Christine and Nathan and Cara and was it Elise? Sorry. Anyway, 3 of them are already in China, and they're in a very different situation to myself, who is teaching online. And I discussed the problem of there being too much Chinese spoken in the classroom, with the coordinator who's in the classroom with them in the university in China, speaking a lot of Chinese. So I haven't a clue what's going on. I mean, Nathan said that he actually does speak some Chinese, so that's not too bad, you know, he can do that. But one thing that I thought was interesting was that, and they have really made me realize this and how I need to change perhaps to motivate adults, which is what I have, young adults, is that their kids, which are much younger, are much more enthusiastic, and they haven't become the sort of person where they're not confident, you know, they're sort of competing with each other in the classroom to be the top person and that sort of thing. You know, mine don't want to make a mistake, don't want to speak out, don't want to, you know, they want to save face. And so one thing that has come out that I'm thinking of now, if I give them time to prepare something, they do much better than if I just throw them into a discussion. Particularly in an oral situation, you know, they're happy to go away and do some thinking. Whereas if you just have a spontaneous thing, it doesn't work, you know. So like debates, things like that just don't work. You know, so I think that's something that I need to think about. You know, if I do want them to speak, let them plan it, let them feel more confident because they've got a piece of paper in front of them.
They need that scaffolding because it's they're very risk averse. I mean, that was my experience when I taught in China. Sorry to just jump in there.
Oh, that's good.
They need a lot of scaffolding. Don't expect them to take risks. It's not something that's rewarded in the culture.
No, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a really helpful point that you've shared, and I think as well, if we, you know, when we go back to the research, really what you're talking about, a lot of it is self-efficacy, and self-efficacy is seen as actually an immensely important trait in successful language learners, and it's so linked to motivation that in some studies you'll find that they almost use it as a motivational proxy. So it's and that's everything that you're talking about comes back to that idea of self-efficacy and creating those safe environments. And I think, you know, Annette's point speaks to that as well, that a lot of the time that's not the educational culture that they've come from, is where you can take risks and risks are rewarded. So that has to be, you know, that kind of creating a safe classroom takes time. And I think it also takes the teacher modeling making mistakes as well. So, you know, again, if we think about Chinese culture, I think Andy was referring to this before, with a lot of Chinese students, there's that idea of the teacher as the ultimate authority. That's right. So the idea of a teacher making mistakes is not, you know, it's not okay. But if we as language teachers, we model the idea of making mistakes and that this is okay, and we see these as learning opportunities that everybody benefits from, then I think we can start to transform that mindset. But thanks for sharing that. That's really important.
Can I just add one little thing? One thing I found again when I was in China is just very low tolerance of ambiguity. Like, and language is inherently ambiguous. Everything's situational, contextual, yada yada. Often my students would just want to tie me down to one particular meaning, and they got frustrated, and I'd say, well, it depends on the context. They hated it when I started sentences like that. They want to just know the black and white answer. I did have young students, so perhaps maturity was also an issue there.
Thanks, Annette.
Because they work in a very highly stressful, competitive environment.
Yes, absolutely.
So, but still, I mean, that's the meaning of we sort of promote a kind of a sort of alternative, giving them a little bit element of choice in the goal setting, or even involving in them in coming up with shared rules, expectations, and that will help them to see that they could decide something in the learning process. Even they agree in the end, we don't tolerate ambiguity, but at least they know that's the decision they make. That's quite important, I think.
Yes.
Can I just bring, I think Amelia, did you have were you going to share something?
Oh, sorry.
Thanks. We were just talking about our experiences based on after your presentation and sort of comments we had about it and questions, and we sort of agreed that the required orientation seemed to be a really sort of important in terms of motivation, but we were surprised that I think it's instrumental prevention wasn't stronger, because sort of some of the teachers, one of the teachers said that they'd worked with primary school students who were new arrivals from Hong Kong, and that pleasing parents was a really big factor, and sort of, so we were thinking that would be around avoiding a negative outcome. Is that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. And I don't think that necessarily what your colleague was reporting contradicts. So if we think of the required orientation, actually, if you read the paper where it was proposed, some of the work that's gone around it, it really is very much tapping into some ideas and philosophies that are integral to Confucian heritage cultures, and the idea that actually exam performance is not just about doing well in exams, it's about actually bringing pride to your family and showing attainment and so on, and pleasing your parents and etc. So actually that does seem to align with what you're talking about among the Hong Kong children. It's if anything, it's perhaps the positive side of it, and so that's something to maybe just bear in mind, that there does need to be more work around the cultural aspects of these different orientations and how they may manifest differently in different cultures. So we talk about ought to, L2 self. Is that really totally distinct from a required orientation, or is it a different kind of cultural understanding of the same thing? So those are kind of questions that we still have to ask. But I think it does echo what your group was discussing as well. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Is there any other groups? Because I think we haven't heard from all the groups, or maybe we have. I don't know. We've heard from 3 groups, so I think there must be someone else. Any other groups want to share their discussion? Otherwise, we do have time for Q&A. Or is there anything else that came up in your discussions that you'd really kind of like to explore a little bit more? If there are no more comments from the discussions per se, I wonder if there are, David, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're okay to move to Q&A at this point. So if there are questions emerging from the presentation, now would be the time to ask them. I don't know if no questions means that it was crystal clear or that nobody understood a word we said.
Can I ask just a quick one?
Yes, of course.
When you spoke about integrated motivation, is that intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation?
Interesting. So yeah, there's a lot of discussion around that too. So we could actually argue it from both sides in one sense, because we could say it's intrinsic in the sense that there's a desire that comes from within the learner to connect with the other culture, but that connection, there has to be another culture there in order for us to want to connect with it. And so you could also argue that originates in something that is outside of the learner. But typically, if we look at the way intrinsic and extrinsic have been used, we would tend to say that an integrative orientation is more intrinsic and an instrumental orientation would be more extrinsic.
Thank you.
No worries. Any other questions? Sorry, I think there's someone trying to talk, but you're on mute. G. Strachan. I think you're still on mute. I don't think I can unmute you. Oh, there we go. Yes, I think you're unmuted now.
Oh, yes. Hi. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Thanks very much for the great presentation, of course. I'm interested in the influence of China's exam-orientated approach to education. I'm teaching at a university here in China. I'm teaching the English major students. I'm currently teaching the advanced writing class. And one of the topics that a lot of the students are talking about is the influence of the exam-orientated education on their own motivation. And I was wondering if you know of much research that's been done on that.
Andy.
Actually, it's quite a well-known phenomenon, and there are research. I think you and Donia's article on the language and motivation in China involves almost like nearly 10,000 students. Exams Well, it depends on what kind of students you talk to. I mean, if you teach in a very good university, they probably won't be talking about exam a lot, but they still very much assessment oriented in learning. They want to be, I mean, I think Annette mentioned they want to be on the top of the game. Whether this is being they can achieve this through examination or whatever, they just want to be top on the game. So that's the desire for success. I think this is to do with the kind of the motivation for promotion, instrumental motivation for motion. But there's also the other side is that if they fall from the game, they don't want, they really want to avoid the consequence of being somehow losing the competition. So that there's also element of fear as well.
Yeah, I think what may also need further exploration is also what because I think that exam washback, I think in terms of motivation, has an immediate effect, whether it's negative or positive. But whether it what it does for sustained motivation, I think is something that needs to be further explored. What it does in the long term. There's not a lot of longitudinal research in motivation. There needs to be a lot more of that, and I think that's going to come because I think there's definitely a much stronger awareness that motivation, even within a class, one lesson, it can fluctuate enormously, more so within a whole year. So I think that needs to be explored as well.
And that's why we believe agentic motivation is important, because agentic motivation will be more sustainable than non-agentic ones.
Yeah, exactly.
If we talk about preparing language learners for lifelong learning or lifelong situation challenges beyond the classroom, really we have to somehow focus on the development or growth of agentic motivation. Yeah.
Just to let you know that that study that Andy referred to, the Yo and Dornier, I've put a link in the chat to that. If I'm not sure if you can access it, but if not, you can contact one of us and we can probably get a hold of that. It's interesting because it's probably one of the largest studies of motivation out there, and it's all done across different age groups within China. So that could be interesting to those of you working in the Chinese context.
Mairin and Andy, I don't want to interrupt the discussion, but I'm just conscious of time.
Yes.
So we might move to your summary quickly.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that's me. So I'll just share my screen again. So we're just going to sum up some of the things that we've really already talked about, and some of which are probably familiar to you, but it's just helpful to sort of, just have a few recommendations as we finish off. So these recommendations are actually taken from, we've sort of combined the things that we've said today, but also from an article which is by Martin Lamb, which again I can share the link for, which is particularly useful because it was a sort of state-of-the-art review of what we know about motivational language teaching practice. So looking across lots and lots of different research studies, what can we conclude about what is good motivational practice in the language classroom? And so these are some of the highlights from that study. So first of all, yes, methods matter, but so does context, and the research backs that up. So the kinds of activities that we want to have in the classroom need to be those that really respond to the specific context of the learners. And so going back to Annette's point previously, that it's difficult to have a one-size-fits-all motivational practice because that wouldn't respond to the needs of the learners that we're dealing with and the context that they are going to be then functioning in. But also by having activities that really respond to that context is where students start to see the relevance of what they're learning in the classroom, and hopefully the immediate relevance. I think that's something to bear in mind. Probably it happens more so in secondary school context or primary than it does in adult learning. But I think that idea of that sort of oh, well, one day in the future you might need this is very difficult for young learners and for adolescent learners to really get their heads around. So it's something that is immediately relevant to their context is important. Learner control. So Andy's been talking a lot about that, and this really comes down to learner agency. So really getting learners to feel that they are in control of events, of their learning and of what's going on in the classroom. And it's that sort of slight paradox in teaching, because obviously as a teacher, you are creating the conditions, but you're creating conditions that make the learner feel that they have control. So they need to feel that they're learning for their own reasons. So that comes back to that goal setting, goals that are really personally relevant to them. And it may be worth having those conversations at the beginning of a learning course, just asking them, what is it that you're seeking to get out of this course? That's often something that, especially in school contexts, we don't do so much necessarily, but actually having that in the open and talking that through with our learners, and then thinking, okay, well, if that's what you want to get out of it, then how do we get you there? Those conversations and getting them engaged in those conversations is really important, and allowing them to determine their sort of learning trajectory. And again, going back to what Annette said, obviously, as a skilled teacher, you are carefully negotiating that with the curriculum demands and with assessment demands and so on. But that learner voice needs to be in there. Research evidence does favor autonomy supportive teaching. So the more that we can support learners' autonomy, the better the student outcomes. And perhaps the question for us to be asking ourselves, because often I get the question, how can I motivate my learners? I don't think that's the best question to be asking. I think the question is, how do I create conditions that wherein my learners can motivate themselves? So that's where we come back to that idea of sustained motivation, and it's not relying on you as the teacher. It's kind of coming from within the learner. The personal is paramount. So this is very much supported by research. And I think you as teachers will all know this. I think teachers across sectors would really kind of probably agree with this, that relational aspect of teaching is really important. The strong rapport between teachers and students, that idea that Andy was talking about respect, mutual respect, is really important. And that is supported by research across the learning domains. But arguably, it's even more important in the language learning context, because so much of language learning is about interpersonal communication, and interpersonal communication, for it to be effective, relies on good relationships and clear communication and so on. And lastly, this idea of the L2 related vision. And this is what the ideal self is really all about. And for this, I recommend to you the work of Kubanyova, of Dernier, who are kind of growing this agenda of vision building in the classroom. So starting by constructing the desired future self, really getting students to think about what kind of learner do they want to be, and what kind of L2 user do they want to be in the future, and then thinking about classroom visualization exercises to get them to imagine what that might look like, and to try and make it as concrete as possible. So actually getting them to imagine themselves in situations where they're actually using the language for real purposes. If you go to, Dernier has a book on this, I think it's him and Jill Hadfield, that is about motivating learners, and they go through lots of different activities for vision building in the classroom. Some of them are a little bit I don't know, they talk about sort of, you know, quiet music in the background and getting people to sort of relax and close their eyes and start to imagine and so on. But I think that can be very effective, and something that maybe takes us to a different dimension in terms of motivational practice in language teaching. And then making the image plausible. So that's really important. So it's all very well students having this ideal self in L2 self in mind, but actually as teachers we then want to make that a realistic and feasible goal, so that they can actually work towards that and actually see themselves progressing and experience success in that. So for that we want to develop a clear action plan where they're setting goals, immediate goals and long-term goals for themselves, and medium-term goals, and then activating that vision to keep it alive. So having regular opportunities in the classroom where we're engaging with those identities and those envisaged identities, where we are talking about them and we're talking about how they're evolving and what they might look like in practice and so on. And then also at the same time, counterbalancing that vision with that reminder of the dangers of failure. Now that sounds a little bit, you know, nobody wants to talk about failure, but I think it is that idea of the ought-to self and the L2 self, ideal self, working in tandem with one another. And that has to be very sensitively done, because obviously our emphasis wants to be on the ideal self, but that preventative orientation is not necessarily something to be completely avoided. It's just something to be sensitively used as a tool in the classroom. And that is the study that I mentioned to you that I would recommend to you if you want like a quick overview. Well, I don't know about quick, depends how quick you read, but an overview of what all the research out there tells us about motivational language teaching practice. And this would avoid you having to read hundreds of articles because Martin Lamb has done it all for you. So that is it for my recommendations there. So I think, am I handing over to David? Shen?
Thank you very much, Mairin and Andy, for your very detailed and thought-provoking presentation. Lots of really great ideas to think about, and I'm sure people will take away from your presentation and their discussion things to talk about with their colleagues. And we're very grateful to you for the time and energy you've spent in preparing and coming along to talk to VicTESOL members and others this evening. So a big thank you from everyone. And if you'd like to thank the presenters, you can do so in the chat. Also in the chat are a number of links that David's put up there. I won't read through them all, but you can see them. One of them that's particularly important is a survey link for the feedback on the session. We're happy to get your feedback, just a short survey with a few questions, and a couple of other links in relation to becoming a VicTESOL member and other professional learning that we're holding in the near future. You'll also get an email from VicTESOL with the resources from today's session, where you can click on those and get the resources, including the PowerPoint and the recording, for you to have a look at your leisure. But once again, thank you to our presenters, Mairin and Andy. It's been a fabulous session, and thank you also to David and to Carly, VicTESOL Professional Learning Coordinator and Admin Officer, for all their work in setting this up. And thank you to the participants for coming and being part of this session today. So on that note, I'll wish everyone good evening.
Thank you. And a big thank you on our behalf as well. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.